How do you survive in a place where nature itself has decided that life is biologically impossible, and where temperatures drop so low that even time freezes? In 1596, a group of 17 Dutch sailors found themselves trapped in ice at the edge of the known world, with only wooden debris and their own stubbornness to fight against the polar night. This is not just a story about a failed expedition. It is a chronicle of the first scientific experiment in human history on survival in the deep Arctic, conducted out of necessity. They had no modern equipment, no communication, and no hope of rescue from outside, but they did have 16th century technology and iron discipline. They had to reinvent their way of life, turning the deadly cold into an ally and the wrecked ship into a fortress. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn the true price, expressed in sweat, pain, and lives, of simply building a roof over their heads in the icy desert of Novaya Zemlya. What if I told you that one of the greatest dramas in the history of seafaring began with unbridled optimism and a belief in easy riches? Amsterdam at the end of the 16th century was the heart of world trade, and merchants were eager to find a short route to China through the northern seas, bypassing the Spanish and Portuguese fleets. Willem Barentsz, an experienced navigator and cartographer, was convinced that warm currents would allow ships to pass over Siberia directly into the Pacific Ocean. The expedition of 2 ships set sail with holds full of goods to trade with the Chinese and a crew dreaming of spices and silk. None of them suspected that instead of the warm waters of Asia, a white hell awaited them, from which no one had ever returned. Their maps were full of blank spots, and their ideas about the climate were based on ancient myths and the guesses of armchair scientists. By August 1596, the ship, commanded by Captain Jacob van Heemskerk and navigated by Barentsz, had rounded the northern tip of Novaya Zemlya. The weather, which had been favorable at first, began to deteriorate rapidly, and the sea became covered with dense fields of drifting ice. The sailors tried to maneuver their way through narrow openings, but with each passing hour, their room for maneuver was reduced. Huge ice floes, driven by the wind and currents, began to squeeze the wooden hull of the ship with tremendous force. There was a terrible crack as the frames broke, a sound that is more frightening to a sailor than a cannon shot. The ship was pushed onto the surface of the ice field like a splinter, unable to move. The crew found themselves trapped in a bay, which they would later call Ice Harbor, realizing that they would not be able to escape until spring. 17 men looked out at the endless white desert, realizing that their home and fortress, the ship, was slowly dying. The ice continued to press down, warping the hull and making it impossible to live on board in the approaching winter. They had to make a decision that went against all maritime traditions and instincts. They had to abandon the ship, which was still afloat, and go ashore onto hostile, frozen land. It was at this moment that the expedition turned into a struggle for survival, where every hour of delay brought death closer. The situation was complicated by the fact that their supplies of food and fuel were not sufficient for a long winter in such extreme conditions. The sailors understood that they would have to spend 9 months in complete darkness and isolation, relying only on what they had managed to take with them. They had no experience of building shelters in permafrost and no suitable tools for working at -40 degrees. Fear of the unknown paralyzed their will, but Barentz's discipline and authority kept the men going. They began to carry supplies ashore, setting up a temporary camp in the open air. Every day the temperature dropped and the daylight hours grew shorter, reminding them of the imminent arrival of the polar night. Hopes that the ice would recede melted with each new storm, which brought only new mountains of ice ridges. People began to realize that their ship, the pride of the Dutch fleet, would never sail again. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What would you do first if you were in Barentz's place? Try to save the ship or start building a house right away? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the secret that saved the expedition from certain death in the first few weeks? The biggest problem on Novaya Zemlya was the lack of building materials, because no trees grew in this tundra. The ground was frozen rock covered with snow, where it was impossible to find even a bush for a fire. However, while exploring the shore, the sailors discovered a real miracle: huge deposits of driftwood washed up by the sea. These were trunks of Siberian trees, carried thousands of kilometers by river currents and bleached by salt water and wind. The devout Dutch took this as a direct sign of divine providence, giving them a chance. But this gift required a titanic effort to be used for its intended purpose in such conditions. The logs lay a considerable distance from the site chosen for the construction of the refuge. The exhausted men had to harness themselves to homemade sleds and drag the frozen, stone-heavy trunks through deep snow. Each trip was a test of endurance, sapping the last of the strength from people whose rations were becoming increasingly meager. The cold wind pierced through them, and the sweat that appeared from the strain instantly froze under their clothes, turning into an icy crust. It was exhausting work, reminiscent of the construction of the pyramids, only in Arctic conditions. They decided to build a house that would later be called Het Behouden Huis, the saved house, or the refuge. The plan was simple and reliable, a rectangular log cabin capable of withstanding hurricane-force winds and heavy snow. For the foundation, they used the same logs, digging them into the permafrost as far as possible. The walls were erected by stacking logs on top of each other, with the gaps between them caulked with moss and scraps of sailcloth. The work progressed slowly as the tools broke from the cold and the men's hands lost sensitivity. When the logs from the fin ran out or proved unsuitable, the crew made the difficult decision to dismantle their own ship. They removed the deck planks, cabins, and even parts of the hull to finish building their new home. It was like a man cutting off his own arm to save his whole body. The ship, which had been a symbol of movement and freedom, was turning into a static box on the shore. Every nail pulled from the ship was a nail in the coffin of their hopes of sailing away in the spring. But there was no other choice. Without a roof over their heads, they would have died in a single night. In the center of the hut, they built an open hearth, which was to become the heart of their survival. They made a chimney out of ship planks, covering them with tin on the inside to prevent fire. They piled snowdrifts around the house to create an extra layer of insulation from the wind. Inside, they built bunks along the walls so they could all sleep together, warming each other with their body heat. It was a primitive but ingeniously designed dwelling, combining maritime technology and an intuitive understanding of thermodynamics. Are you willing to sacrifice your only means of transportation for a slim chance of survival in stasis? What I am about to show you is not described in any architecture textbook of the time, but it saved their lives. Building the hut was not simply a matter of stacking logs. It was an engineering feat full of unconventional solutions. Barentsz and his men understood that Dutch fireplaces would not work in conditions where the wind blew so strongly that it pushed the smoke back. So they designed a complex exhaust system above the hearth, using an upside-down barrel as a smoke collector. This design kept the heat inside while minimizing the risk of smoke filling the room. To insulate the roof, they used an old sail, which they stretched over the boards and covered with sand and earth. This sandwich was covered with a layer of snow and ice, which froze to create an airtight shell. The floor was also insulated. They used ship planks laid in several layers to prevent the cold from the permafrost from penetrating inside. The gaps in the walls were plugged with whatever was at hand. Old clothes, ropes, moss, creating an airtight capsule. This was perhaps the first attempt in history to create an energy-efficient house in an extreme climate. Special attention was paid to the doors, which were the most vulnerable place for cold to penetrate. They made a low entrance with a high threshold to minimize the loss of warm air when opening. In addition, they built a kind of vestibule out of snow blocks in front of the entrance, creating an airlock. This allowed them to go outside without cooling down the main room, which was critically important. Inside the house, they hung oil lamps, which not only provided light but also added a little heat. All these technical tricks turned a rough log cabin into a complex survival machine. Every detail of the interior had a double or triple purpose. Barrels served as tables and chairs, chests as cupboards and partitions. It was this engineering ingenuity that allowed them to survive where less prepared people would have perished. If you enjoyed this story about ancient survival technologies, don't forget to like this video. Are you ready to learn the truth about what happens to everyday objects at minus 50 degrees? With the onset of the polar night, the cold became not just a weather phenomenon, but a physically tangible enemy that penetrated everywhere. The diary of Gerrit de Veer, a member of the expedition, describes the terrifying details of how frost changed the physics of matter. Wine and beer in barrels froze, breaking the iron hoops as if they were made of paper. To get even a drop of liquid, sailors had to chop the ice with axes and melt pieces of frozen sherry over a fire. Even inside the safe house, despite the constantly burning hearth, the temperature was deadly. The walls were covered with a thick layer of frost that did not melt even a meter away from the fire. The backs of the people sitting by the fire were covered with an icy crust, while their faces and hands were scorched by the heat. Clothes soaked with sweat during the day turned into an icy shell at night that was impossible to remove. The sailors slept in their clothes, covering themselves with everything they had, but still woke up from the piercing cold. The most shocking moment was when the ship's clock, the expedition's main timekeeper, stopped. The mechanism simply froze. The lubricant thickened. The springs became brittle and stopped working. From that moment on, they lost track of time, relying only on an hourglass that had to be turned over every 12 hours. This required constant vigilance and discipline, because losing track of time threatened to cause complete chaos. Without a clock, day blended into night, turning life into an endless gray nightmare. In this realm of absolute zero, they realized how fragile human civilization was. All their tools, knowledge, and habits proved useless in the face of cosmic cold. Only adaptation and abandonment of the old rules could save them. But the cold was not the only threat. The air inside the hut held an even more insidious trap. In the next chapter, you will learn how an attempt to keep warm nearly killed the entire expedition in one evening. The most frightening moment of the winter came not from attacks by predators or hunger, but from an attempt to create comfort. On one particularly frosty day, when a blizzard had buried the house up to the roof, the crew decided to heat the room with coal. They had brought this coal with them on the ship for blacksmithing and guarded it like the apple of their eye. Wanting to conserve the precious heat, they made a fatal mistake. They closed the chimney tightly and caulked all the cracks. They thought they would finally be able to sleep in the warmth, just like at home in Holland. A pleasant warmth began to spread throughout the hut, and the tired men felt blissful. The conversation became more cheerful, the tension eased, and many began to go to bed with smiles on their faces. But soon, one after another, the sailors began to complain of dizziness and a strange weakness in their legs. No one immediately understood what was happening, attributing it all to fatigue and a sudden change in temperature. It was a classic symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning, an invisible killer with no color or smell. The first to raise the alarm was the weakest of them, who lost consciousness while trying to get up from his bunk. The others, trying to help him, realized that they themselves could not move. Their muscles refused to obey, their consciousness was clouded, and their hearts were pounding wildly in their chests. Panic seized the men, but they no longer had the strength to scream or run. Death was just minutes away from claiming the entire crew, who were peacefully falling into an eternal sleep. Only through an incredible effort of will did one of the sailors manage to crawl to the door. He couldn't stand up, so he literally fell out into the snowy vestibule and threw open the outer door. The icy air that rushed into the room hit them like a hammer, but it was this air that brought salvation. Oxygen began to displace the poisonous gas, bringing people back to their senses. They lay on the floor, gasping for frosty air, coughing and coming to. This incident was a harsh lesson. Air tightness in the Arctic can be as dangerous as the cold. Since then, they have never completely closed the chimney, preferring to freeze but breathe clean air. They realized that comfort here was an illusion for which they had to pay too high a price. This incident also showed how dependent they were on each other. If that sailor had not crawled to the door, the expedition would have ended that very night. Gerrit de Veer later wrote in his diary that it was punishment for pampering. They realized that trying to cheat nature and create an artificial climate had nearly cost them their lives. After this incident, discipline became even stricter, and ventilation control became paranoid. They survived, but the fear of suffocating in their sleep remained with them until the end of the winter. The coal incident was a turning point in their thinking. They stopped trying to recreate Amsterdam in the Arctic and accepted the harsh rules of the game. Now their goal was not warmth, but a balance on the verge of survival. They learned to appreciate the slightest movement of air, even if it brought frost with it. The lesson was learned. In the fight against nature, you cannot relax for a second. Even fire, their main friend and protector, could treacherously stab them in the back. This experience brought the team even closer together, turning them into a single organism, sensitive to any danger. In the end, they returned to burning wood, saving every piece of driftwood. The coal remained lying in the corner as a reminder of a fatal mistake. This episode showed that knowledge and caution are more important than resources. They continued their struggle, but now with a new understanding of the fragility of their existence. Every breath became a treasure to be cherished and protected. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how people stay sane in complete darkness and isolation? It would seem that in conditions of hunger, cold, and mortal danger, there is no room for celebrations. But Willem Barentsz and Captain Heemskerk understood that despair kills faster than scurvy. To keep their spirits up, they strictly followed the calendar of religious and secular holidays. The most memorable event was Twelfth Night, which they decided to celebrate no matter what. On that day, they took out the last crumbs of luxury from their supplies, a little wine, which they had saved for a special occasion, and the remains of white flour. The cook baked pancakes in butter, and the smell of fried dough in the frozen hut became for them the smell of home, hope, and life. They chose the King of the Evening by drawing lots, and this title went to the chief canon. For a few hours, they forgot that they were on the brink of destruction, playing the roles of courtiers and laughing at jokes. It was not just entertainment, but powerful psychological therapy. Rituals allowed them to feel connected to the civilized world that remains somewhere far to the south. They read aloud from the Bible and secular books they had with them, discussing philosophy and geography. These conversations helped their brains from deteriorating in conditions of sensory deprivation. Routine and schedule became their anchor in a sea of chaos. Heemskerk introduced strict discipline, including mandatory physical exercise. When the weather permitted, they went outside to play a kind of golf or simply run to get their blood flowing. It looked surreal, a bunch of people in rags chasing a ball among the ice floes under the light of the northern lights. But it was this movement that saved their bodies from atrophy and their souls from despair. The saved house was a fortress, but it was not besieged by people, but by the masters of the Arctic, polar bears. For the Dutch, these animals were real monsters, ferocious, huge, and absolutely fearless. The bears perceived the hut as a strange object on their territory, inside which there was the smell of food. They regularly tried to get inside, storming the doors and even climbing onto the roof. For the sailors, every trip outside to gather firewood turned into a military sortie with reconnaissance and cover. The firearms of the time, flintlock muskets, were extremely unreliable in the cold. The fuses went out, the mechanisms jammed, and the gunpowder got damp. Often, the shots simply did not fire at the most critical moment. Therefore, halberds and spears became the main weapons of defense. Imagine hand-to-hand combat with a 500-kilogram predator using medieval pole weapons. This required incredible courage and coordinated action from the entire team. Bears were cunning and attacked suddenly, using the cover of white snow and the darkness of the polar night. Once, a bear almost dragged a sentry away from the entrance to the hut. Screams, the barking of a ship's dog, and blows from halberds drove the beast away, but fear took root in the hearts of the people. They set up a surveillance system, constantly checking the perimeter through cracks in the walls before opening the door. The siege lasted for months. The bears did not let them relax, constantly reminding them who was the real master here. But these attacks had a downside. A killed bear meant hundreds of kilograms of meat and fat. Bear fat was used for lamps, providing light during the long nights. However, they did not dare to eat the bear's liver, knowing from local legends or intuition that it was poisonous due to an excess of vitamin A. The fight against the bears united the team into a combat unit. They learned to act as a single mechanism, covering each other's backs. Each successful defense raised morale, giving them a sense of superiority over nature. They realized that even with primitive weapons, humans could withstand the most formidable force of the Arctic. These battles became part of their daily life, a routine of survival. They stopped fearing bears as mystical monsters and began to treat them as a dangerous but surmountable obstacle. This change in perception was an important step in their psychological adaptation. With the arrival of the sun in January 1597 came new hope. But with it came the bitter realization that the ship would not be freed. The ice had so badly damaged the hull that repairs were impossible. The ship sat on the reefs of ice ridges like a monument to their hopes. The only way to return home was in two small open boats, yawls, which had miraculously survived. But these boats were designed for short trips in port, not for sailing in the open Arctic Ocean. Feverish work began on refitting the boats. It was engineering improvisation of the highest order. The sailors built up the sides using planks from the deck of the wrecked ship to protect the boats from high waves. They sewed sails from the remains of the ship's canvas, reinforced the masts, and built primitive shelters from spray and wind. Every detail was thought out to the smallest detail, because at sea it would be impossible to correct a mistake. The second critical issue was provisions. They needed to take enough food and water for several weeks, but there was catastrophically little space in the boats. They had to ruthlessly select only the most necessary items: crackers, a little wine, tools, and navigational instruments. Personal belongings, souvenirs, and even some clothing had to be left behind at the safe house. It was a choice between memory and life. By this time, Willem Barentsz was seriously ill. He suffered from scurvy and extreme exhaustion, could not walk, and moved only on a sled. But his mind remained clear, and he continued to oversee preparations for departure. He personally checked the charts and calculated the course, understanding that everyone's life depended on his knowledge. The crew carefully carried their leader to one of the boats, making him as comfortable as possible. Before setting sail, they wrote a letter detailing their story and hid it in the chimney of the hut. It was a message to future generations in case they perished at sea. They wanted the world to know about their feat and their suffering. They carefully locked the hut, leaving it as a monument to their stay. On June 14, 1597, after nearly 10 months of icy captivity, they pushed their boats away from the shore. It was the moment of truth. Either they would reach the mainland or they would perish in the waves. 17 men in two flimsy shells against the endless ocean of ice. They rowed away from the place that had become their home and prison without looking back. The journey in open boats became the most grueling ordeal of the entire expedition. They traveled more than 1,600 miles, about 2,500 kilometers, across icy waters, exposed to storms, snow, and sun. The men were soaked through 24 hours a day. Salt water corroded their skin, the cold hampered their movements, and hunger tormented them constantly. They slept sitting up, huddled together, or on hard boards when they managed to pull the boats onto the ice. Willem Barentsz was fading away with each passing day. Scurvy was destroying his body, but he continued to keep track of their course. Lying at the bottom of the boat, he asked to be lifted up so he could see the coast and compare it with his maps. Even on the verge of death, he remained a scientist and navigator whose main passion was discovering the truth. He corrected errors on the maps, made notes, and gave instructions to the helmsman. On June 20th, 1597, just a week after setting sail, Barentsz died. Ironically, this happened not far from the islands he had discovered. He died looking at the map he had created himself, remaining faithful to his duty until his last breath. The death of their leader was a terrible blow to the crew, but they could not afford to stop for a long funeral. The body of the great navigator was committed to the sea, the element to which he had devoted his entire life. They continued on their journey, now led by Captain Hemser. Without Barentsz, they felt like orphans, but his maps and calculations guided them forward. They weathered storms that could have capsized ocean-going ships in their small boats. They hunted birds and seals for food and drank meltwater from icebergs. Their encounter with Russian pomors was their first contact with civilization. The Russian fishermen, seeing the emaciated foreigners, showed compassion and fed them bread and fish. It was the first real food they had had in many months, and to the Dutchmen, it tasted better than any royal feast. The Pomors confirmed that they were heading in the right direction, which gave them new hope. When two small boats carrying 12 survivors entered the port of Amsterdam on November 1st, 1597, the city fell silent. The people who came ashore looked like visitors from another world. They were dressed in polar bear skins and the remains of old uniforms, their faces blackened by frostbite and wind, their eyes burning with a strange fire. They brought with them not gold and spices, but a story of incredible courage and maps of new lands. The merchants who financed the expedition were disappointed. Commercially, the venture had failed. The Northeast Passage had not been found, the goods were lost, and the ship was destroyed. But for the common people and sailors, these men became national heroes. They had done the impossible, they had survived the winter in hell, and returned to tell the tale. Gerrit de Veer's diary became a bestseller of its time. It was translated into many languages, and Europe read with bated breath about the saved house, bears, and icy captivity. This book became the first textbook on polar survival. It dispelled many myths about the Arctic and provided future explorers with invaluable knowledge. The fate of the saved house remained unknown for almost 3 centuries. It was not until 1871 that Norwegian hunter Elling Carlsen accidentally stumbled upon the ruins of the hut on Novaya Zemlya. What he saw astonished the world. The house was almost intact. Inside, everything remained as the Dutch had left it in 1597. Tools, weapons, dishes, clocks, books, and even that very letter were found in the hut. The cold had preserved history, creating an open-air museum. These artifacts were carefully collected and transported to the Netherlands, where they are now kept in the Rijksmuseum as a national treasure. The return of Barentz's expedition proved that the Arctic is accessible to humans, but requires respect and preparation. This ushered in an era of whaling and new exploration of the North. Although they lost their ship, the Dutch gained a reputation as the world's best sailors, capable of overcoming any obstacle. The story of the winter on Novaya Zemlya is one of the most striking examples of human resilience in history. Willem Barentsz and his men did not just survive, they invented ways of surviving that were ahead of their time. They defeated the storm, cold, and hunger, but paid a terrible price for it, losing their leader and 5 comrades. Their experience showed that in extreme situations, the main resources are not equipment, but discipline, ingenuity, and mutual support. What do you think of this story of icy captivity? What impressed you the most? Building a house out of their own ship or traveling in open boats? Suggest topics for future videos about great survival stories in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories.